My name is Nia, and at 34 years old, I sat in the coldest room in Atlanta, watching my mother destroy my life with a smile on her face. At my grandfather's will reading, surrounded by mahogany walls and judgment, my family thought they had finally crushed me. They gave my younger sister Keisha the company, the money, and the power, leaving me with nothing but a brown envelope and a lifetime of insults. They called me useless. They mocked my cheap suit. They thought I would cry. But they did not know what was inside that envelope. They did not know that my grandfather had left me the one weapon that could destroy them all. Before I tell you how I made my mother scream in a room full of lawyers, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch the people who should love you the most try to tear you down. The air inside the Sterling Law Firm offices in Buckhead was always freezing, but today it felt colder than a morgue. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, smoothing the fabric of my $50 department store suit, trying to make myself as small as possible. The heavy oak door swung open, and the click-clack of expensive stilettos announced my mother's arrival before I even saw her. Viola swept into the room like she owned the building, draped in black silk that probably cost more than my car. Her eyes landed on me instantly, and her lip curled in that familiar expression of disgust she reserved only for her eldest daughter. "Oh, God." Viola sighed loudly, not even bothering to lower her voice as she turned to my father, Marcus, who was trailing behind her like an obedient puppy. Today is the most important day in the history of the Ezekiel legacy, and Nia decided to dress like she is selling term life insurance door to door. Look at her, Marcus, she makes the whole room look dim. My father just grunted, avoiding my gaze as he took his seat. I said nothing, just digging my fingernails into my palms until they left crescent-shaped marks. I was used to this. In Viola's world, my darker skin and refusal to play the socialite game made me a stain on her perfect image. The door opened again, and my younger sister Keisha breezed in. She was 30 years old and holding her phone up at a perfect angle, live streaming her entrance to her 100,000 followers. She was wearing a vintage Chanel morning dress that I knew for a fact cost $3,000 because I had seen the charge on the family credit card statement I secretly monitored. "Hey guys," she whispered to her phone, pouting her lips for the camera. "We are here at the lawyers. So sad about Grandpa, but big things are coming. Stay tuned." She finally lowered the phone and plopped down next to me, the scent of her custom perfume overpowering the room. "Move over, Nia," she hissed, nudging me hard with her hip. "This dress is silk and it needs room to breathe, unlike whatever polyester nightmare you are wearing." My brother-in-law, Brad, sat down on my other side, completing the circle of hostility. Brad was the kind of guy who thought marrying a black woman gave him a pass to be disrespectful as long as he did it with a smile. He stretched his long legs out deliberately, crossing his ankles so his expensive loafer dug into the side of my chair. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and expensive mints. "Hey, Nia," he whispered, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Since you are already up or look like you should be working, why do not you go grab me a bottle of water from the lobby? You are used to serving people, right? That is what you do." I froze, the memory of 2 years ago flashing through my mind. Brad had come to my tiny apartment, sweating and desperate, begging for $2,000 to fix the transmission on his BMW because he had gambled away the allowance Keisha gave him. He had sworn on his life he would pay me back the next week. I had given it to him because, despite everything, I did not want my sister to suffer from his stupidity. He had never paid me back. Not a dime. And now he looked at me like I was the help. I turned to him, my face completely blank. "Get it yourself, Brad," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. "Or ask your wife to buy you a bottle. I hear she has plenty of credit limits she has not maxed out yet." Brad's face turned a deep shade of red, and his smile vanished instantly. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl that only I could hear. "Watch your mouth, Nia. You think you are tough, but after today, you are going to be nothing. You are going to be begging us for scraps, and I am going to enjoy watching you starve." I wanted to tell him that I had seen his bank records. I wanted to tell him I knew about his secret crypto wallet that was currently down 60%. But I held my tongue. The time for that would come later. For now, I just stared him down until he blinked and looked away, muttering something about ungrateful relatives under his breath. The room was buzzing with the low murmur of my family's self-congratulatory chatter. Viola was already planning which room in the mansion she would redecorate first. Keisha was taking selfies. Marcus was looking at photos of cars on his phone. They were vultures circling a carcass they had not even killed. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the end of the room swung open again. The chatter cut off instantly as Mr. Sterling walked in. He was a tall man with iron-gray hair and a face that revealed absolutely nothing. He carried a leather briefcase so thick it looked like it contained the secrets of the entire city. He walked to the head of the massive table and dropped the briefcase onto the mahogany surface. Thud. The sound was dry and heavy like a gavel striking a death sentence. It echoed in the silence, cutting through the tension like a knife. Even Keisha put her phone away. Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked around the room, his gaze lingering on me for a fraction of a second longer than the others. There was something in his eyes. It was not pity. It looked almost like anticipation. Mr. Sterling did not waste time with pleasantries. He opened the leather-bound folder with a deliberate slowness that made the air in the room feel thin. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read, his voice a dry monotone that betrayed no emotion whatsoever. I, Ezekiel Brooks, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit and the rapid tapping of Keisha's acrylic nails against her phone screen. First to my only daughter Viola. Sterling read, not looking up. I leave the family estate in Buckhead, including all furnishings, art, and the surrounding grounds. Current market valuation is approximately $5 million. The reaction was immediate and theatrical. Viola let out a strangled sob, pressing a lace handkerchief to eyes that remained suspiciously dry. "Oh, Daddy," she wailed, leaning her head onto my father's shoulder. "He loved that house so much. I promised to keep it exactly as he left it. It will be a shrine to his memory. It was a good performance award worthy even. But I was a forensic accountant. I watched people for a living. I saw the way her eyes darted around the room, not with grief but with calculation. She was not thinking about preserving my grandfather's legacy. She was already mentally calculating the property value, the equity she could borrow against, and the status update she would post later. She was thinking about how much power that address gave her in Atlanta's social circle. Sterling waited for her performance to subside before continuing. To my son-in-law, Marcus, he read, I leave my personal collection of vintage automobiles currently stored in the climate-controlled garage at the estate. Valuation is approximately $2 million. My father did not even try to hide his excitement. He let out a sharp breath, his hand forming a fist under the table which he pumped once in victory. Those cars were his obsession. For years he had begged my grandfather to let him drive the 1963 Corvette or the vintage Rolls-Royce, and my grandfather had always refused, saying Marcus did not respect the machinery. Now they were his. I could see him mentally revving the engines, imagining himself cruising down Peachtree Street, looking like the big shot he had always pretended to be. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. $7 million in assets had just been distributed in less than 2 minutes. My family was already rich, but now they were wealthy in their own right, independent of the allowance my grandfather had doled out to keep them in check. They looked at each other, grinning like vultures who had just found a fresh carcass. They had what they wanted, or so they thought. But the air in the room shifted. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Sterling did not close the folder. He reached for the corner of the page and turned it with a crisp, snapping sound. The minor assets were gone. The house, the cars, the furniture. Those were just toys. Now came the engine that paid for it all. Sterling looked up, his gaze sweeping over Keisha, then Viola, and finally resting on me for a brief, unreadable moment. And now he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly register that commanded absolute silence. We come to the core asset of the estate, the Ezekiel Hair Care Corporation. Sterling did not pause for effect. He read the words with a brutal efficiency that hit like a physical blow. To my granddaughter Keisha, I leave the entirety of the Ezekiel Hair Care Corporation, including all manufacturing facilities, distribution networks, and intellectual property. Furthermore, attached to this corporate bequest is the Ezekiel Liquid Capital Trust, valued at exactly $20 million. The silence in the room shattered. It was not a gasp, it was a scream. Keisha launched herself out of her chair, her phone clattering to the table. 20 million, she shrieked, grabbing Brad by the lapels of his jacket. Did you hear that, baby? We own it all. We are the kings of this city. Brad was grinning like a wolf who just found an open sheep pen. He pulled her close, and I saw his lips move against her ear. We are rich, babe. We are never working again. Viola sat back in her chair, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She looked at Marcus, then at me, her eyes gleaming with malice. See, she said loudly over Keisha's celebration. Daddy knew. He always knew who the star was. Sterling raised a hand demanding silence. He was not finished. There is a codicil explaining the reasoning for this decision, he stated. The room quieted down instantly. Keisha smoothed her dress, looking like she had just won a pageant. Sterling read from the document. I make this decision because the face of Ezekiel Hair Care must reflect a certain aesthetic. Keisha possesses the lighter, brighter complexion and the approachable image that the modern market demands. She is the face that will sell our future. I felt the blood drain from my face. Those were not my grandfather's words. Those were Viola's words. For years she had whispered in his ear while his mind was fading, telling him that my skin was too dark to sell beauty products, that I was too intense, too intimidating. She had weaponized colorism to steal my birthright, and now she had it in writing, signed by the man I loved most. It was the ultimate betrayal. Keisha turned to me, her eyes wide with mock sympathy. Oh, Nia, she cooed, tilting her head. Don't be mad. It is just business. You know how it is. Some people are made for the spotlight, and some people are made to stay in the shadows. Brad laughed, a low, ugly sound. Better luck next time, Nia. Oh, wait, there isn't a next time. This is it. You are out. I sat there stone-faced, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a single tear. They thought this was the end. They thought they had stripped me of everything. They were celebrating a victory built on racism and manipulation. But the show was not over. Sterling closed the folder on the corporate assets. The heavy thud silenced the room once more. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me. His expression was unreadable, but the air in the room suddenly grew heavy again. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound that commanded attention. We have one final matter to address, he said, regarding the bequest for my granddaughter Nia. Sterling reached into the depths of his briefcase one last time. The room leaned forward in collective anticipation, waiting for another bombshell, another million-dollar property, or a secret offshore account. But Sterling did not produce a deed or a stock certificate. He pulled out a single standard manila envelope. It was thin, painfully thin. It looked like the kind of envelope you would use to mail a single tax return or a termination letter. He slid it across the polished mahogany table until it stopped directly in front of me. Regarding Nia, Sterling said, his voice devoid of the earlier grandeur used for Keisha's inheritance. Your grandfather's instructions were quite specific. I leave you no financial assets, no property, no shares in the corporation. I leave you this envelope and a single piece of advice. Earn your own way. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then my mother threw her head back and let out a laugh that was sharp and jagged like broken glass. It started low and erupted into a full-blown cackle of triumph. She slapped the table with her hand, her diamond rings clacking against the wood. I told you, she shouted, pointing a manicured finger at my face. I told you he knew. He saw right through you, Nia. He knew you were nothing but a bean counter calculating pennies while the rest of us made history. He knew you did not have the soul for this family or the look for this brand. You are too small for this legacy. Keisha joined in, giggling behind her hand. Oh my God, she whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. Imagine getting a letter telling you to get a job while I get $20 million. That is actually embarrassing. Even Brad let out a snort, shaking his head as if he pitied me. I looked at the envelope. It sat there plain and brown against the dark wood. It was an insult, a final slap in the face from the only man I thought respected me. He had left me nothing but a lecture. Earn your own way. As if I had not been earning my own way since I was 18 years old, while my sister drove cars paid for by his checkbook. The humiliation burned hot in my throat, threatening to spill out as tears, but I swallowed it down. I would not give them that satisfaction. Not today. Not ever again. I stood up slowly. The leather chair scraped against the floor. The sound cut through their laughter. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at my sister or her parasite husband. I reached out and picked up the envelope. It felt light, almost weightless. I tucked it under my arm and straightened my jacket. Are you not going to say thank you, Nia? Viola sneered. He gave you exactly what you deserve. I said nothing. I turned my back on them, on the millions of dollars, on the family that had just shown me exactly who they were. I walked to the heavy oak doors, my cheap heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. I could feel their eyes boring into my back, their mockery hanging in the air like smoke. I grabbed the brass handle, turned it, and stepped out into the hallway. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, sealing them in their tower of gold, and leaving me with nothing but a brown envelope and the cold, hard truth. I walked toward the elevator, and I did not look back. My apartment in Midtown was a different universe from the Buckhead estate. It was small and it was rented, but it was clean, and most importantly, it was mine. I paid the rent with money I earned auditing fraud cases for mid-sized firms. There was no mahogany here, no silk drapes, just a simple desk from IKEA and a view of the parking lot. I threw my keys in the bowl by the door and locked the deadbolt. The silence of the apartment wrapped around me like a protective blanket. I was finally away from the perfume and the insults and the suffocating greed of my family. I sat down at my desk and placed the brown envelope in the center of the blotter. It looked innocuous. A piece of stationery you would use to send a check to the electric company. But it felt heavy, heavier than paper should feel. I ran my thumb under the flap and tore it open. The sound was loud in the quiet room. I tipped the contents out onto the desk. 2 items fell out. The first was a notebook. It was small and bound in cracked black leather that had been worn smooth by years of handling. It smelled like bergamot and old hair pomade. It was the smell of my grandfather. It was the smell of the factories he walked through every day before his health failed. I ran my hand over the cover. I had seen him writing in this book 1,000 times, but he had never let anyone touch it. Not Viola, not Keisha, certainly not me. The second item was a USB drive. But it was not a cheap plastic stick you pick up at a conference. It was heavy, solid metal, brushed steel with a biometric fingerprint scanner embedded in the center. It looked military grade. It looked like something that held nuclear launch codes, not family recipes. I picked up the notebook first. My hands were trembling slightly. I opened the cover. The first page was filled with my grandfather's handwriting, but it was not the bold, confident script of his younger years. It was shaky, spidery. It was written by a man who knew he was running out of time. I read the words aloud to the empty room. Nia, I apologize for the act. I had to be cruel to protect you. I had to make them think you were nothing so they would not see you coming. You are the only one smart enough to save this family, and the only way to save it is by destroying it first. I stared at the page, destroying it. The words seemed to vibrate. He did not hate me. He had never hated me. He had been playing a role. He had been protecting me from Viola's jealousy and Keisha's greed by hiding me in plain sight. He knew that if he gave me money openly, they would have sued me or guilted me into giving it up. But this was a mission. I put the notebook down and picked up the steel USB drive. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my life hunting for hidden assets and tracing illicit cash flows. I knew a data dump when I saw one. My grandfather had not left me money. He had left me the truth. I swiveled my chair to my computer rig. 3 monitors hummed to life. I pressed my thumb against the scanner on the drive. A tiny green light blinked once, twice. Then it turned a solid, steady blue. I plugged the drive into the USB port. My screens flickered. A command prompt window opened automatically. Code scrolled down the center monitor faster than I could read. It was decrypting. Layers of security were peeling away like the skin of an onion. Then the scrolling stopped. A single dialog box appeared in the center of the screen with bold green text that illuminated my face in the dim room. Master key access granted. The numbers on the screen were not just data points. They were a timeline of my trauma. I scrolled back through the years, my eyes scanning the ledger entries my grandfather had secretly compiled. Column A was the date. Column B was the amount. Column C was the lie they told me. And column D was the truth. My cursor hovered over an entry from 16 years ago. May 15, 2008. The amount was $85,000. The label read, Harvard tuition rejected due to lack of liquidity. The memory hit me so hard I could smell the magnolias in the driveway of the Buckhead estate. I was 18 years old. I was wearing my high school uniform, the skirt slightly too long because Viola hated me showing legs. I was clutching a crimson folder to my chest so tight the corners were bent. It was the acceptance letter. Harvard University. It was my ticket out. It was the proof that I was more than just the dark-skinned daughter they hid in the back of family photos. I ran into the living room breathless. Mom. Dad, look. I got in. Viola was sipping iced tea on the white sofa. She did not even put her glass down. She took the folder, flipped it open, and sighed. Harvard, she said, her voice flat. That is very expensive, Nia. We are in a recession, you know. The market is down. Our assets are tied up in real estate and inventory. We simply do not have the liquidity to send you there. State school is perfectly adequate for someone with your skill set. Marcus nodded from his armchair, not looking up from his racing magazine. Listen to your mother, Nia. We are cash poor right now. You need to be realistic. I believed them. I was stupid and young, and I believed them. I withdrew my acceptance. I enrolled in the state university and took a night job at a diner to pay for my books because they said they could not even help with that. Then my eyes shifted to the next line on the spreadsheet. May 22nd, 2008. Exactly 1 week later. The entry read, Keisha Sweet 16 gift, $80,000, cash withdrawal. I remembered that day too. I remembered standing by the garage watching Keisha run out into the driveway screaming. There it was, a brand new pearl white BMW 6 Series convertible with a giant red bow on the hood. It sparkled in the sun. It looked like a spaceship compared to the bus I took to campus. Viola was clapping, laughing, hugging Marcus. Look at her, Marcus, she squealed. She looks like a princess in that car. It matches her complexion perfectly. They had lied to my face. They did not lack liquidity. They had plenty of cash. They just did not want to spend it on me. They would rather buy a toy for their 16-year-old golden child than educate their 18-year-old scholar. I remembered running to the downstairs powder room that day, locking the door and sliding down the wall to the cold tile floor. I buried my face in my knees and sobbed until my throat was raw. But as the tears dried, a cold resolve settled in my chest. I looked at myself in the mirror, my eyes red, my face swollen. I made a vow to my reflection. I swore that I would never be lied to about money again. I swore I would learn how to track every cent, every wire transfer, every hidden account. I would become the master of their secrets. And today, looking at the digital proof of their betrayal on my monitor, I knew I had kept that promise. The cursor blinked, moving down the spreadsheet to another date that was burned into my memory. November 12th, 2015. I was 25 years old. I was lying in a hospital bed in the emergency room, doubled over in agony. The doctor had just told me I had a ruptured ovarian cyst. It was complex, it was dangerous, and I needed surgery immediately to save my ovary and possibly my life. The cost for the uninsured procedure was $5,000 up front. I was working as a junior auditor, then barely making rent, and my insurance had lapsed when I switched jobs. I remembered the shame of asking the nurse for a phone. I dialed the only number I knew by heart. My mother's personal line. She answered on the second ring, the background noise of soft jazz and chatter filtering through. "Mom," I gasped, clutching my side. "I am at the hospital. I need surgery. It is $5,000. Please, I will pay you back. I just need it now." Viola sighed, a long, exasperated sound that made me feel like a child asking for candy before dinner. "Oh, Nia, always with the drama. You know we do not keep that kind of cash lying around. Our money is in the ground, honey. It is tied up in the new distribution center land in Savannah. We are illiquid right now. You will have to figure it out. Ask the hospital for a payment plan. That is what poor people do, right?" She hung up. I ended up signing a predatory loan agreement with an interest rate so high it took me 3 years to pay off a 2-hour surgery. I had believed her. I had believed that my wealthy family was momentarily cash poor. But the spreadsheet on my screen told a different story. I looked at the entry for November 12th, 2015. The same day I was bleeding on a gurney. There was no land purchase. There was no capital investment in Savannah. There was a debit from the primary operating account, $10,000. The payee was the Buckhead Spa and Salon. The memo line added by my grandfather's meticulous hand read, "Viola facial and new Hermes Birkin deposit." She had lied to me while I was in critical condition. She had $10,000 to spend on her face and a purse, but she could not spare half that to save her daughter from medical debt and physical trauma. She had chosen a handbag over my health. The rage that filled me was not hot and explosive. It was cold. It was absolute. It was the kind of anger that does not scream but calculates. They had shown me no mercy. They had shown me no love. They had treated me like a liability to be managed while they siphoned off the family fortune for their vanity projects. I stared at the glowing monitor, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. The tears that had threatened to fall earlier were gone, evaporated by the heat of my fury. I was done being the victim. I was done being the sad, rejected daughter. I cracked my knuckles and leaned forward. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. It was time to stop reading history and start writing the future. I began to type. The timeline on my screen jumped forward to the present day. It had been 48 hours since the will reading and the self-destruction of the Ezekiel Empire had officially begun. I sat in the dark of my apartment, the blue glow of the monitors painting my face in spectral light. On the left screen, I had a live feed of Keisha's Instagram. On the right screen, I had the master administrative access to the Ezekiel Haircare corporate treasury. The two images told a story of impending disaster that only I could see. Keisha was not in Atlanta anymore. She was in Miami, standing on the deck of a 100-foot yacht that I knew for a fact cost $15,000 an hour to charter. She was wearing a white bikini and holding a magnum of champagne that cost more than my first car. She was screaming into the camera, her voice distorted by the wind and the bass of the music. "Welcome to the new era of Ezekiel Haircare," she yelled over the noise, her eyes glassy and bright. "We are taking over the world, baby. No more boring budgets. No more old people rules. We are spending money to make money." She turned the camera to show Brad, who was wearing a gold chain I had never seen before and smoking a cigar the size of a baton. He winked at the camera and tapped the black card sitting on the table in front of him. The American Express Centurion card, the black card. It was the ultimate symbol of unlimited spending power. It was supposed to be used for capital investments and inventory acquisition. Instead, it was being used to buy bottle service for strangers. I looked at the right monitor. A red alert box had popped up in the center of the screen. It was a fraud prevention warning from the bank. The algorithm had flagged a transaction attempting to clear. The amount was $50,000. The merchant was the Diamond Club, Miami. The category was entertainment. Under normal circumstances, this transaction would be automatically blocked. It was reckless. It was outside of normal operating parameters. It was financial suicide. My finger hovered over the mouse. I had the power to stop this. I had the biometric clearance to freeze the accounts, to lock the cards, to shut down the entire party before the first cork was popped. It would have been the responsible thing to do. It would have been what a good accountant would do. I could save the company right now. I could save the employees who depended on those funds for their paychecks. But then I remembered the look on Viola's face when she called me useless. I remembered Keisha laughing as she took the $20 million. I remembered my grandfather's shaky handwriting in the notebook telling me to destroy it to save it. If I stopped them now, they would just find another way. They would fire me. They would sue me. They would claim I was jealous. No. They needed to fall. And they needed to fall from a height so great that they could never climb back up. I moved the cursor away from the decline button. I dragged it over to the button marked Override Security Protocol. I clicked it. A second box appeared asking for authorization. I typed in the code my grandfather had left in the notebook. Nemesis. The screen flashed green. Authorization accepted. Transaction approved. On the left screen, Keisha cheered as a waiter brought out a tray of diamonds and sparklers. She had no idea that the money she was spending was not profit. It was leverage. I watched the numbers in the corporate account drop, red digits hemorrhaging cash. I leaned back in my chair, my face cold and expressionless. Go ahead, Keisha, I whispered to the empty room. Eat up. Let us see if you can swallow it. I closed the live feed of Keisha's yacht party. Watching them burn money was satisfying, but I needed ammunition, not just entertainment. I turned back to the historical ledger on the USB drive. My grandfather had flagged several accounts with a simple red tag indicating irregularities he had found but never acted upon. He had left the execution to me. I clicked on the first flagged account. It was labeled Operating Expenses, Warehouse Maintenance. On the surface, it looked legitimate. A monthly wire transfer of $20,000 for upkeep, repairs, and security at the distribution centers. It had been auto-paid on the first of every month for the last 10 years. But as I drilled down into the metadata, the cracks began to show. The vendor name was listed as SL Holdings, LLC. I cross-referenced it with the vendor master file. There was no tax ID, no invoice history, and no work orders. Just a routing number and a recurring payment that had drained $2.4 million from the company over a decade. I opened a new window and ran a trace on the routing number. It linked to a private bank in the Cayman Islands, which usually meant a dead end. But I was not just an accountant. I was a forensic specialist. I knew how to follow the digital breadcrumbs. I accessed the property tax records associated with the LLC's registered mailing address here in Atlanta. It was not a warehouse. It was not a repair shop. It was a penthouse apartment at the Sovereign, one of the most expensive residential towers in Buckhead. I pulled up the deed. The owner of record was SL Holdings, but the occupant listed on the building's concierge registry was a woman. Her name was Sugar, just Sugar. No last name listed in the guest log, though the deed had a signature that looked like a heart. I did a quick social media search. It took less than 30 seconds to find her. Sugar was a 28-year-old lifestyle model with an Instagram feed full of designer bags, red bottom shoes, and a vintage red convertible that looked suspiciously like the one my father had claimed was in the shop for 6 months back in 2018. I sat back, the air hissing through my teeth. My father, Marcus. The man who walked 2 steps behind Viola and nodded at everything she said had been embezzling $20,000 a month to fund a secret life. While Viola was screaming at me about the cost of my state college tuition, Marcus was paying the mortgage on a penthouse for a woman younger than me. While I was taking out predatory loans for surgery, he was buying sugar diamond anklets. He had stolen millions from the family he claimed to serve right under Viola's nose. The hypocrisy was so thick I could taste it. Marcus played the role of the devoted henpecked husband, letting Viola take the heat for being the villain, while he quietly bled the company dry. He was not a victim of her controlling nature. He was a parasite feeding off the host. I took a screenshot of the deed. I downloaded the entire transaction history of the warehouse maintenance account. I compiled the photos from Sugar's social media that featured the gifts my father had likely purchased. I bundled it all into a single encrypted file. I moved the cursor to the desktop and created a new folder. I typed 3 letters, DAD. I dragged the file into the folder and listened to the soft click of the mouse. 1 down, 2 to go. My phone buzzed violently against the desk, the vibration rattling the empty coffee mug I had pushed aside hours ago. The screen lit up with a FaceTime request. The caller ID read, Keisha CEO. She had updated her contact information before the ink on the probate documents was even dry. I accepted the call and propped the phone against the base of my monitor, creating a split-screen view of my sister's face and the financial precipice she was dancing on. Keisha filled the frame, her face flushed and shiny with sweat and expensive champagne. The background was a blur of white fiberglass and turquoise water. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she did not care. She was holding a bright orange Hermes Kelly bag up to the camera lens like a trophy. Nia, she shrieked, her voice slurring slightly over the roar of the wind. Look what I just bought. It is a limited edition. $40,000. I bought one for Mom, too. We are twinsies, can you believe it? We are celebrating the takeover. I stared at her, my expression flat. That is a nice bag, Keisha, I said, my voice devoid of inflection. Is that why you called? To show me your accessories? She giggled, a high-pitched sound that grated on my nerves like sandpaper. No, silly. I called to check on you. I wanted to see if you were still crying over your little brown envelope. I wanted to make sure you saw what real success looks like. She took a swig from a crystal flute, spilling a little down her chin. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. You know, Grandpa was so smart, she continued, her eyes glassy. He really got us. He knew you were just boring. You are meant to be in a cubicle, Nia. You are meant to count other people's money, not spend your own. That is why he gave it all to me. He knew I had the style to make this brand global. You are just a calculator. I am the vision. She preened for the camera, adjusting her bikini top. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my steepled fingers. I needed to gauge the depth of her ignorance. I needed to know if there was even a spark of business acumen beneath the vanity. Keisha, I asked quietly, do you know the difference between revenue and net profit? Keisha blinked. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of genuine confusion, before she rolled her eyes and let out a scoff of derision. Oh my God, Nia. You are such a buzzkill. Who cares about the math nerd stuff? That is what we hire people like you for. As long as the money keeps flowing in, it does not matter. And trust me, it is flowing. She waved the black card in front of the camera lens, blocking out her face. This thing is magic, she bragged. It never stops. Actually, it does stop, I thought, and the wall is coming faster than you think. Whatever she said clearly bored with my lack of jealousy. Go back to your spreadsheets, Nia. I have a party to finish. Try not to be too miserable in your little apartment. The screen went black as she ended the call. The silence rushed back into the room. I set the phone down and turned my attention back to the main monitor. I minimized the window containing the evidence of my father's embezzlement and maximized the real-time cash flow analysis for Ezekiel Hair Care. Keisha was right about one thing. The money was flowing. But she was wrong about the direction. The graph on my screen looked like a steep cliff. The line representing the company's operating capital was nosediving straight toward the x-axis. Between the yacht rental, the designer bags, the jewelry, and the high-end catering, they had burned through nearly $300,000 in 48 hours. I watched the red line dip lower pixel by pixel. They were celebrating their ascent to the throne, completely unaware that they had already walked off the edge. I picked up my coffee mug and took a slow, deliberate sip. Gravity was about to teach them a very expensive lesson. While Keisha was popping champagne in Miami, Brad was sitting in the pool house back in Buckhead, nursing a bruised ego and a bottle of expensive bourbon. I could reconstruct his night just by watching the digital footprints he left behind. Brad hated being Keisha's husband. He hated that the money, the power, and the attention were hers. He wanted to be the man. He wanted to be the tycoon. And like every mediocre man with more ambition than intelligence, he thought the shortcut to respect was a high-risk gamble. My system flagged the unauthorized login at 3:14 a.m. It was Brad's laptop accessing the corporate treasury portal using Keisha's credentials. He didn't even have the decency to hack it properly. He just used the password she probably had written on a sticky note. He navigated straight to the Emergency Liquidity Fund, the rainy day account my grandfather had built over 40 years to survive recessions and pandemics. It held exactly $5 million. I watched the keystrokes appear on my monitor in real time. He opened a new browser tab. Crypto exchange. He wasn't buying Bitcoin or Ethereum. He was buying something called Moondog Rocket, a meme coin that had launched 3 days ago and was being hyped by bots on Twitter. He was dumping $5 million of hard-earned manufacturing capital into a digital Ponzi scheme. A red dialog box flashed on my screen. Unusual activity detected. High-value transfer initiated. Authorize block. My finger hovered over the enter key. I could stop this. I could freeze the transfer, lock him out, and save the company's safety net. It would take one click. I thought about the employees in the factory who relied on that fund for job security. I thought about the legacy my grandfather built. But then I remembered the feel of Brad's shoe digging into my thigh at the lawyer's office. I remembered him demanding I fetch him water like a servant. I remembered him taking my $2,000 and laughing about it. If I saved them now, they would never learn. They would just think they were invincible. They needed to feel the ground disappear beneath their feet. I pulled my hand back from the keyboard. I let the timer on the security alert count down. 10 seconds, 5 seconds, 3, 2, 1. Auto approval granted. The screen refreshed. The transfer bar filled up rapidly, moving from 0 to 100% in seconds. The balance of the emergency liquidity fund plummeted. The numbers scrolled down like a slot machine, finally settling on a single stark digit, zeros on dollars. $5 million gone, vaporized into the ether of the blockchain. Brad had just bet the entire future of the company on a joke currency. I imagined him in the pool house, leaning back in his chair, thinking he was a genius, thinking he was about to turn 5 million into 50. He had no idea he had just signed his own death warrant. I took a screenshot of the zero balance. I logged the IP address and the timestamp. I added it to a new folder on my desktop labeled BRAD. The trap was set. The safety net was gone. Now all I had to do was wait for the crash. 3 months later, the digital house of cards collapsed. It did not happen slowly. It happened all at once on a rainy Tuesday morning that would go down in Atlanta business history. I sat in my office watching the live ticker for Moondog Rocket. The developers had rug pulled. In the span of 6 minutes, the value of the coin dropped by 99.9%. $5 million of my grandfather's legacy vanished into the pockets of anonymous scammers. Brad's genius investment was now worth less than a used car. The dominoes began to fall immediately. At the port of Savannah, 6 shipping containers filled with essential shea butter and organic oils from Ghana were flagged for non-payment. The suppliers had tried to draw on the letter of credit, but the bank had refused. Insufficient funds. Without raw materials, the manufacturing lines at the Ezekiel plant ground to a halt. The silence in the factory was deafening. It was the sound of an empire dying. Keisha, oblivious as always, tried to fix the problem by throwing paper at it. She signed payroll checks for 300 employees with her signature pink gel pen, smiling for Instagram as she handed them out. "We love our team," she captioned the photo. "Bonus season comes early." 24 hours later, the checks started bouncing. It was not just a financial error, it was a felony in the making. In Georgia, writing bad checks for wages is a crime. The employees did not just get mad, they got organized. I turned on the local news. The aerial footage showed the gates of the Buckhead estate. It looked like a siege. Dozens of factory workers were gathered outside the wrought iron fence, holding signs that read, "Keisha stole our rent, and Ezekiel would be ashamed." Police cars were flashing their lights, trying to keep the crowd back from the manicured lawn. A reporter stood in front of the chaos, microphone in hand. "Breaking news," she said, her face grave. "The Ezekiel Hair Care empire, a staple of black business in Atlanta for 40 years, appears to be in freefall. Sources say the company has defaulted on payroll and suppliers, raising the question, is this the end of the dynasty?" Viola was visible in the background of the shot, standing on the balcony, in a silk robe, screaming at the police to arrest the trespassers. She looked deranged. Her perfect world was cracking open, and she had no idea how to stop it. Keisha was nowhere to be seen. She was probably hiding in her walk-in closet, wondering why her black card was not working anymore. I took a sip of my tea, the steam curling against the cool air of my apartment. I had warned them. My grandfather had warned them. But they had chosen to listen to their own vanity instead. The destruction was total. It was catastrophic. And it was exactly what needed to happen. My phone buzzed on the desk, vibrating so hard it walked a few inches across the wood. I looked at the screen. The name flashing there was one I had not seen in 3 months. Mom. I watched the phone ring until the screen went black. I did not have to wait long for the sequel. 30 minutes later, a pounding on my front door shook the frame of my apartment. It was not a polite knock. It was the kind of hammering that meant the police or a fire, or in my case, a desperate mother who had run out of options. I checked the peephole. Viola was standing in the hallway, her face twisted into a mask of fury. Marcus was behind her, looking over his shoulder, as if he expected the paparazzi to jump out of the drywall. They had found me. Of course they had found me. Viola probably paid a private investigator $5,000 to track down the address she had never bothered to ask for in 10 years. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. I did not invite them in, but Viola did not need an invitation. She pushed past me, bringing a gust of expensive perfume and panic into my sanctuary. Marcus followed, closing the door and locking it as if they were fugitives. Viola spun around, her chest heaving. She looked terrible. Her makeup was caked in the creases of her eyes, and a single strand of hair had escaped her perfect bun, hanging limp against her cheek. It was the first time I had ever seen her look unpolished. "Why did you not answer the phone?" she screamed, her voice shrill enough to shatter glass. "We have been calling you for an hour. Do you have any idea what is happening? The news vans are at the gate, Nia. The police are talking about fraud. Your sister is hysterical." I walked past her into the living room and sat down on my beige sofa. I picked up my cup of tea and took a sip. "I know exactly what is happening," I said, calm as a frozen lake. "Keisha wrote checks she could not cash. In the state of Georgia, that is a misdemeanor for anything under $500. But for a payroll of 300 people, that is a felony. Several felonies, actually." Viola marched over and loomed over me. "Stop talking like a lawyer," she spat. "You are a forensic accountant. You know how to fix this. You know how to move numbers around. You need to get into the system and make those funds appear. You need to backdate the transfers or hide the deficit in the amortization schedule or whatever it is you boring people do. You have to fix the books, Nia." Marcus nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "Just until we can liquefy some assets, Nia." just to keep the authorities off her back. She is young. She made a mistake. She cannot go to prison. I looked at them. They were not asking for help. They were demanding I become an accomplice. They wanted me to use the very skills I had mastered to catch criminals to become one myself. They wanted me to cook the books to cover up their golden child's incompetence. I set my teacup down on the coaster with a soft clink. I looked my mother in the eye. "Let me get this straight," I said. "You want me to falsify corporate records? You want me to commit wire fraud? You want me to obstruct a federal investigation?" Viola stamped her foot. "Do not use those words. You are helping your family. You are saving your sister." I leaned back, crossing my legs. "No, Mother," I said. "You are asking me to trade places with her. You want me to go to prison so Keisha can stay in the mansion. Is that it? You want the spare heir to take the fall for the princess." Viola's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The vein in her forehead pulsed beneath her flawless foundation. She lunged forward across the small space between us. I saw it coming, but I did not move fast enough. Her hand connected with my cheek with a sharp cracking sound that echoed off the drywall. It was a sting I had not felt since I was 18 years old, standing in the kitchen holding my Harvard acceptance letter. "You ungrateful little wretch," she screamed, her voice raw and ugly. "I gave birth to you. I put clothes on your back. I put a roof over your head. You exist to serve this family. You will fix this for your sister because I said so. You will do your duty, Nia." She raised her hand to strike me again. But I was not 18 anymore. I was not the girl who cried in bathrooms. I reached up and caught her wrist in midair. Her arm was thin and her bones felt brittle under my grip. I squeezed just hard enough to stop her, just hard enough to let her know that the power dynamic had shifted permanently. Her eyes widened in shock. She tried to yank her arm back, but I held it firm. "You did not give birth to a daughter, Viola," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You gave birth to an insurance policy. You kept me around as a spare part, just in case your golden child broke. Well, the policy has expired. I am not your janitor. I am not your fixer. And I am certainly not going to prison for you." I shoved her hand away from me. She stumbled back a step, rubbing her wrist, looking at me like I was a monster she had accidentally created. Marcus took a step forward, trying to regain control of the room. "Now, Nia," he began, using his fake authoritative voice. "Do not touch your mother like that. We are all under a lot of stress. We just need to find the money. If we can find the missing liquidity, we can cover the payroll and make this go away." I looked at him, the man who had played the role of the hapless bystander for 30 years while stealing us blind. "You want to find the liquidity, Dad?" I asked. "You want to know where the cash reserves went?" I walked over to the side table where I had stacked the files. I picked up the red folder labeled Dad. I did not hand it to him. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It slid across the surface and stopped right in front of Viola. "Ask him," I said, pointing at Marcus. "Ask your husband why the warehouse maintenance fund has been paying the mortgage on a penthouse at the Sovereign for the last 10 years. Ask him who Sugar is." Viola froze. She looked at the folder, then at Marcus, then back at the folder. Her hands were shaking as she reached out and flipped it open. The first thing she saw was a high-resolution photo of a 28-year-old woman leaning against a vintage red convertible. The same red convertible Marcus had told Viola was in the shop for repairs 3 years ago. The next page was a bank statement showing a monthly transfer of $20,000. Viola stopped breathing. She stared at the photo of Sugar wearing a diamond anklet. It was the same anklet Viola had wanted for her anniversary, but Marcus had told her they needed to be frugal. The silence in the room was absolute. Viola slowly lifted her head. She released the breath she had been holding in a long, shuddering hiss. She turned her head slowly, mechanically, until she was looking directly at Marcus. The look in her eyes was not just anger, it was murder. Viola let out a sound that was not human. It was a guttural shriek of betrayal that seemed to rip from her throat. She looked at the picture of Sugar wearing the diamond anklet, and then she looked at Marcus. The veneer of the sophisticated buckhead matriarch evaporated instantly. She lunged at him, her fingernails raking across his face, drawing thin lines of blood down his cheek. "You stole from me!" she screamed, grabbing him by the lapels of his Italian suit and shaking him violently. "You took my money. You took my father's money to keep a harlot in a penthouse. I gave you everything, Marcus. I gave you a life. I gave you a name. And you spent 10 years laughing at me with some girl young enough to be your daughter." Marcus stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and landing hard on the floor. He scrambled backward, crab walking away from her, fury holding his hands up to protect his face. But then his fear turned into something ugly. He laughed, a harsh barking sound. "You gave me a life," he shouted back, wiping blood from his cheek. "You gave me a cage, Viola. You treated me like an employee for 30 years. And do not talk to me about wasting money. You want to know where the rest of the liquidity went. Ask your golden child. Ask Keisha." Viola froze mid-strike, her hand raised in a claw. "What are you talking about?" she hissed. Marcus scrambled to his feet, straightening his jacket with trembling hands. "You think I am the only one draining the accounts? Brad accessed the treasury 2 days ago. He took $5 million, Viola, the entire emergency reserve. He bet it all on some digital coin because he wanted to be a big shot. And he lost it all. Every single cent. Your precious son-in-law burned $5 million in an hour, and Keisha let him do it because she gave him the passwords." Viola looked like she had been struck by lightning. She staggered back, her hand going to her chest. "5 million, she whispered. "That cannot be true. Keisha would not." "She is incompetent," Marcus yelled. "She is a child playing dress-up, and you are the one who gave her the keys." "I took a salary, Viola. I took what I was owed for putting up with you. They burned the company down." I stood against the wall, my arms crossed over my chest, watching them tear each other apart. It was like watching rats fight on a sinking ship. They were so busy blaming each other they did not realize the water was already over their heads. I felt nothing for them. No pity. No sadness. Just a cold, clinical observation of their destruction. I walked to the front door and threw it open. The cool night air rushed in, clearing the stench of their expensive cologne and their rot. "Get out," I said, my voice cutting through their screaming match. They both stopped and looked at me. For a second they seemed to remember I was there. They seemed to remember that they had come here to force me to commit a crime. "Get out of my house," I repeated, pointing to the hallway. "Take your drama and your debts and get out. If you are not gone in 10 seconds, I am calling the police and sending them the file on Dad and the file on Brad." Viola looked at me, her eyes wide and wild. She looked at Marcus, then at the door. She straightened her spine, trying to summon the ghost of her dignity. "This is not over, Nia," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You think you are smart. You think you have won. But you are still nobody. You will pay for this." She marched out the door, her heels clicking angrily on the concrete. Marcus followed her, clutching his bleeding cheek, casting one last hateful look in my direction. I slammed the door shut and locked the deadbolt. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood and listened to them screaming at each other all the way down the hallway. They were leaving, but I knew they would be back. They needed a scapegoat, and I was the only one left. Keisha did not take the news of the missing $5 million well. According to the security logs I was monitoring, she changed the gate codes at the Buckhead estate exactly 12 minutes after I kicked our parents out of my apartment. Brad was not just in the doghouse, he was on the street. His clothes were likely burning on the front lawn, and his access to the easy life had been revoked permanently. A parasite without a host is a dangerous thing, and I knew exactly where he would come to feed. I left my office building at 10 p.m. The parking structure was deserted, a concrete echo chamber of silence. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long, flickering shadows against the gray walls. I walked toward my modest sedan, keys in hand. I was not afraid. I was waiting. I knew a man like Brad would not blame himself. He would not blame his greed or his stupidity. He would blame the person who held the keys. He stepped out from behind a concrete pillar 20 feet from my car. He looked like a wreck. His expensive designer shirt was stained and untucked, and his eyes were wild with a mixture of sleeplessness and cheap whiskey. He was holding an aluminum baseball bat, gripping the handle so hard his knuckles were white. He blocked my path to the driver's side door, swinging the bat lazily by his side. "You did this," he rasped, his voice echoing in the empty garage. "You locked the accounts. You made the coin crash. You set me up, Nia." I stopped walking. I did not reach for pepper spray. I did not scream. I just looked at him with the same detached curiosity a scientist uses to observe a bacteria under a microscope. "I did not make you buy a meme coin, Brad," I said calmly. "You did that all by yourself. I just watched. And honestly, it was the most expensive comedy I have ever seen." He roared a sound of pure, impotent rage and slammed the bat into the concrete pillar. Sparks flew. "Fix it," he screamed. "Get on your computer and unlock the treasury. Put the money back, undo whatever hack you did. Or I swear to God I will smash this car into scrap metal with you inside it. Open the accounts, Nia." He took a step toward me, raising the bat. He thought he was terrifying. He thought violence could reverse a blockchain transaction. He thought intimidation worked on someone who had survived Viola's psychological warfare for 30 years. He was wrong. I did not back down. I took a step closer to him, which made him pause in confusion. I raised my hand, but not to surrender. I pointed a single finger up toward the ceiling of the parking deck directly above his head, to the dark corner where a red light blinked steadily in the gloom. "Brad," I said, my voice cutting through his heavy breathing. "Look up. Smile for the camera." Brad looked up at the red light blinking in the darkness. His brain processed the trap a second too late. The silence of the garage was shattered by the deafening chirp of a siren and the blinding flash of blue and red strobe lights bouncing off the concrete walls. 2 patrol cars screeched around the corner, blocking the exit ramp and boxing us in. I had called them 12 minutes ago when I first saw Brad loitering on the building's external security feed. I knew he was coming before he even parked his car. I was a forensic accountant. I tracked patterns for a living, and Brad was nothing if not predictable. "Drop the weapon," a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Drop it now." Brad's face went pale. The bravado evaporated, leaving behind a terrified man holding a metal stick. The bat clattered to the concrete floor, rolling away from him with a hollow metallic ring. He put his hands up, trembling violently. "I did not do anything," he stammered, his voice cracking. "We are just talking. She is my sister-in-law." Officers swarmed him. They did not care about his excuses. They saw a man with a weapon cornering a woman in a deserted garage. They slammed him against the hood of the cruiser, kicking his legs apart. I watched the metal cuffs click around his wrists with a profound sense of satisfaction. It was the sound of consequences finally catching up to him. An officer approached me, notebook in hand. "Are you hurt, Mom?" he asked. "No," I said, handing him a USB drive I had prepared earlier, "but he threatened to kill me and destroy my vehicle. The audio and video from that security camera are all on here. I want to press charges to the fullest extent of the law." The officer nodded, pocketing the evidence. "We have him on possession of a weapon with intent and terroristic threats. He is not going anywhere tonight." I walked over to where they were shoving Brad into the back seat. He looked pathetic. His expensive shirt was torn and he was crying, snot running down his face. I motioned for the officer to wait a second. I leaned down until my face was inches from the window. Brad looked at me, expecting mercy. He expected me to tell them it was a misunderstanding, because that is what Nia the doormat would have done. I smiled. "You are not just broke, Brad," I whispered through the glass. "You are stupid. You really thought violence would fix a math problem." He stared at me, his eyes wide. "And here is a free tip." I continued. "Do not call Keisha for bail money. She does not date losers who lose $5 million. She is probably drafting the divorce papers right now to save her own skin. Enjoy jail." He started screaming, thrashing against the restraint, spitting curses at the glass. I straightened up and thanked the officers. I walked to my sedan and unlocked the door. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The sound was smooth and reliable. I put the car in gear and drove past the police cruiser, past Brad's contorted, screaming face, and out into the cool night air. The rearview mirror showed nothing but red and blue lights fading into the distance. I turned on the radio and hummed along to the music. One predator down, two to go. The chaos with Brad was loud and public, but the real destruction arrived quietly in a white envelope 3 days later. The Internal Revenue Service does not scream. They do not send text messages. They send certified mail with a return receipt requested. When the mail carrier handed the thick packet to Keisha at the gates of the Buckhead estate, she thought it was a contract for a reality TV show. She was wrong. It was a formal notification of an audit from the Criminal Investigation Division. I saw the alert hit the system before they even opened the envelope. My grandfather had set up the corporate accounts to trigger a notification to the forensic auditor me whenever a federal subpoena was issued. I sat in my office and read the digital copy. It was catastrophic. Because Keisha had mixed personal spending with corporate funds, and because Brad had moved $5 million into an unregulated offshore crypto exchange, the IRS algorithms had flagged the entire company for potential money laundering and tax evasion. To the government, it did not look like stupidity. It looked like a crime ring. And because the corporate accounts were now overdrawn, and the payroll checks had bounced, the IRS took the immediate protective step of freezing the assets. Keisha found out when she tried to order a smoothie. Her card was declined. She tried another one. Declined. She logged into her banking app and saw the terrifying words in red text. Account frozen by court order. Panic is contagious. Within an hour, the freeze extended to the guarantors of the corporate loans. That meant Viola. My mother went to the grocery store to buy wine to soothe her nerves and found herself humiliated at the checkout counter. Her platinum card was a useless piece of plastic. The freeze order had hit her personal accounts, and because she had signed as the guarantor for Keisha's takeover, the Buckhead estate itself was now listed as collateral subject to seizure. Viola did not scream this time. She hyperventilated. The prospect of losing her money was bad, but the prospect of losing her status was a death sentence. She scrambled for the phone, her hands shaking so badly she dropped it twice before dialing the only number she thought could save her. Arthur Sterling answered on the first ring. His voice was calm, professional, and utterly devoid of the warmth he used to fake for them. Arthur, you have to stop them, Viola cried into the receiver. The government has frozen everything. They are talking about seizing the house. They are treating us like criminals. You are the company lawyer. Fix this. Make a call. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear Sterling adjusting his glasses. Viola, he said slowly, this is not a misunderstanding. This is gross negligence and forensic malfeasance. The IRS does not freeze assets without substantial evidence. I cannot simply make a call to the federal government and ask them to ignore $5 million of missing capital. Then what do we do? Viola sobbed. We have no money. We have no lawyers. We are going to lose the house. I have arranged a conference, Sterling said. It is time to execute the final clause of your father's estate planning. We need to meet at my office tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. I will be there, Viola promised. I will bring Keisha. We will sign whatever we need to sign. No, Sterling interrupted, his voice turning steel hard. Do not just bring Keisha. You are required to bring Naya. If she is not in the room, the meeting does not happen and the house goes to auction. Do not be late. The mahogany walls of the Sterling law firm were the same, but the atmosphere inside was unrecognizable. 3 months ago, this room had been filled with champagne toast and arrogant laughter. Today it smelled of stale sweat and absolute defeat. It felt less like a law office and more like a holding cell for white-collar criminals waiting for sentencing. I walked into the room 5 minutes late on purpose. I pushed open the heavy double doors, and the sound of my heels on the hardwood floor was sharp and authoritative. I was not wearing the $50 polyester blend suit from the department store rack. I was wearing a bespoke Italian wool power suit in charcoal gray, tailored to fit me perfectly. It cost $2,000, and I had paid for it in cash with the bonus from my latest forensic audit contract. I surveyed the wreckage of my family. Keisha sat slumped in her chair, a ghost of the girl who had live-streamed her victory here. Her hair, usually extensions of perfection, was pulled back in a messy knot. Her face was bare of makeup, revealing dark circles under eyes that were red from crying. She was wearing a baggy sweatshirt and leggings, looking like a college student who had just failed finals. When I walked in, she did not even look up. She just stared at the table, her hands shaking slightly in her lap. Viola sat next to her, rigid and pale. The stress of the last week had aged her 10 years. Her skin looked papery, and the lines around her mouth were etched deep with bitterness. She clutched her handbag to her chest like a life preserver. She looked at me as I entered, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in her eyes, instead of judgment. And then there was Marcus. My father was exiled to a chair in the far corner, separated from the women. The angry red welts from Viola's fingernails were still visible on his cheeks, scabbing over in jagged lines. He looked small. The bravado he had shown when he got the car collection was gone, replaced by the sullen silence of a man who knows he has lost everything. I walked to the empty chair directly across from Mr. Sterling. I did not ask if I could sit. I pulled the chair out, sat down, and placed my leather portfolio on the table. The silence stretched out thick and uncomfortable. They were waiting for me to speak. They were waiting for me to gloat, or to scream, or to offer to save them. I did none of those things. I simply crossed my hands on the table and looked at the lawyer. Mr. Sterling nodded at me, a flicker of professional respect in his eyes that had not been there before. He cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice cutting through the gloom. "As you know, the assets of the Ezekiel Haircare Corporation and the personal assets of the primary guarantors are currently frozen pending a federal investigation. The company is insolvent. The liquidity is gone." Viola let out a small whimper, but Sterling ignored her. He stood up and walked to a large flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall. He picked up a remote. "Your grandfather was a brilliant businessman," Sterling continued. "But he was also a realist. He knew his family better than you knew yourselves. He predicted that if given total control without checks and balances, the company would collapse within 6 months. You managed to do it in 3. He paused, letting the shame sink in. Because of this probability, he left a fail-safe protocol, a Clause B that only activates in the event of total insolvency. He recorded a video message to be played only when the bank accounts hit 0. Sterling pointed the remote at the black screen. "He wanted to tell you the truth himself. Watch the screen." The screen flickered to life, and the pixels arranged themselves into the familiar face of Ezekiel Brooks. He was sitting in his leather armchair in the library, wearing his favorite smoking jacket. He looked healthier in the video than he had in his final days, his eyes sharp and his voice steady. The sound of him clearing his throat filled the silent conference room, making Viola jump in her seat as if she had seen a ghost. "My dear family," Ezekiel began, his voice booming from the surround sound speakers. "If Arthur is playing this recording, it means the inevitable has happened. It means the factory is silent. It means the accounts are empty. And it means the Ezekiel Haircare Corporation has officially failed." Keisha let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Ezekiel on the screen seemed to look right at her. "Do not cry, Keisha," he said sternly. "I knew you did not have the capacity to run this business. You have the face for billboards, but you lack the discipline for boardrooms. I gave you the company, not because I believed in you, but because I needed to teach this family a lesson that words could not convey. I knew Marcus would steal. I knew Viola would spend. And I knew within months you would burn my legacy to the ground." Viola gasped, clutching her chest. "How could you?" she whispered at the screen. "We are your blood." The video, Ezekiel leaned forward. "You thought the $20 million trust was a gift. You were wrong. It was a test. That money was never liquid cash sitting in a vault. It was a valuation based on the brand's projected worth. It existed only on paper. And since you have destroyed the brand's reputation with scandal and fraud, that $20 million is now worth absolutely nothing." The room went deathly still. The inheritance was a mirage. They had spent real money chasing a fantasy, and now the bill had come due. But Ezekiel was not finished. However, he continued, his eyes glinting with a hard lesson. There is one part of the company finances that is very real. For the last 5 years, I have been quietly leveraging the company's assets. I took out loans. I bought out bad contracts. I accumulated debt, specifically $35 million in secured debt. 35 million? Marcus choked out his face, turning a sickly shade of gray. We are $35 million in the hole. Yes, Ezekiel said on the screen. The company is not just broke, it is underwater. And the terms of the debt are aggressive. Upon the declaration of insolvency, which you have now triggered, the creditor has the right to seize all assets immediately. The factory, the inventory, the intellectual property, and thanks to Viola, signing as a guarantor, the Buckhead estate as well. The video cut to black, leaving the room in a stunned, terrified silence. They were not just poor. They were destitute. They owed a fortune to a ghost. Who holds the note? Viola whispered, her voice trembling with hysteria. Who do we owe this money to? Is it the bank? Is it the government? Sterling stood up and turned off the monitor. He looked at the family with a pitying expression before turning his gaze to me. No, Mrs. Brooks, Sterling said. It is not a bank. Your father sold the debt to a private holding company 2 years ago. He wanted to ensure that if the company failed, the assets would fall into the hands of someone who actually knew how to run them. Sterling picked up a thick document from his desk. He slid it across the table toward me. The creditor is a blind trust, Sterling said. And the sole beneficiary of that trust is the person sitting across from you. He looked directly at me. Nia, you are the creditor. You own the debt. And as of this morning, you own everything. The silence in the room was heavy enough to crush bone. Viola looked at Sterling, and then she looked at me, her eyes darting back and forth as if trying to find the punchline to a terrible joke. Who, she whispered, who is the beneficiary? Who do we owe everything to? Sterling adjusted his glasses and placed his hand on the thick document. He did not look at Viola. He looked directly at me with a nod of professional acknowledgement. The debt is held by a private entity called the Phoenix Trust. Sterling said, his voice calm and final. And the sole trustee and beneficiary of the Phoenix Trust is sitting right there. It is Nia. The air left the room in a rush. Viola made a sound like a balloon deflating. Marcus stared at me, his mouth hanging open. Keisha stopped crying instantly, her face freezing in a mask of shock. That is impossible, Viola stammered, her voice rising in pitch. She has nothing. She is a forensic accountant. She lives in a rental. She cannot own a $35 million debt. Sterling turned a page in the file. The brown envelope she received at the will reading did not contain money, he explained. It contained the encryption keys and the transfer of ownership deeds for the trust. Your father set this up 5 years ago. He bought the debt from the bank and placed it in the trust. He gave the trust to Nia. He knew that if the company succeeded, she would never need to use it. But if the company failed, if you drove it into insolvency, Nia would automatically become the senior secured creditor. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. I looked at my mother, who was now trembling so violently her bracelets rattled. Do you know what that means, Mother? I asked, my voice soft but filling the room. It means I am not just your daughter anymore. I am your bank. I am the institution that owns the mortgage on the Buckhead estate. I hold the title to the factory. I hold the liens on the cars. You do not owe the government. You do not owe a stranger. You owe me $35 million. I stood up slowly, towering over them. And since I know you do not have the cash to pay me back, I am exercising my legal right to seize the collateral. I am taking the house. I am taking the cars. I am taking the brand. I am taking everything. Viola looked at me, and for the first time she realized the absolute total nature of her defeat. She had bullied me for being poor while unknowingly living in a house that I effectively owned. She had mocked my cheap clothes while spending money that legally belonged to me. The reality hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes rolled back in her head and her knees gave way. She collapsed into the leather chair, sliding sideways until she was half on the floor, gasping for air. Marcus scrambled to help her, but I did not move. I just stood there, smoothing the lapel of my bespoke suit, and for the first time in years, I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile, the smile of a creditor collecting what was due. I unzipped my leather portfolio with a slow, deliberate sound that seemed to slice through the whimpering of my mother. I pulled out a document stamped with the official seal of the Fulton County Superior Court. It was an asset seizure schedule and it was long. I placed it on the table, smoothing it out so the bold text was visible to everyone. According to the foreclosure statutes of the state of Georgia and the terms of the secured debt, I am initiating the immediate liquidation of all collateral, I announced. My voice was steady, professional, and utterly merciless. This includes the primary residence at the Buckhead Estate. It includes the entire collection of vintage automobiles currently in the possession of Marcus Brooks. And it includes all personal luxury items purchased with corporate funds, which legally classifies them as company property. That means the jewelry. That means the designer bags. That means the watch on your wrist right now, Keisha. The reality of homelessness finally pierced through Keisha's bubble of delusion. She looked at the paper, then at me, and then she did something I never thought I would see. She scrambled out of her chair. The girl who had looked down on me her entire life threw herself onto the floor. She crawled across the expensive rug and grabbed my ankle, burying her face in the fabric of my new suit pants. "Nia, please," she sobbed, her mascara running in black streaks down her face. "You cannot do this. You cannot take the house. Where will I live? I do not know how to do anything else. I will be on the street. Please, sister. I am sorry. I am so sorry." I looked down at her. From this angle she looked small, pathetic, a child who had broken a toy and expected the adults to fix it, but the adult in the room was the one she had tormented for decades. I did not pull my leg away immediately. I let her cry on my shoes. I let the silence stretch out until her sobs were the only sound in the room. "Do you remember November 12th, 2015? Keisha?" I asked quietly. She looked up, confused, sniffing loudly. "What?" "I was in the emergency room." I continued, my voice devoid of warmth. "I was bleeding internally from a ruptured cyst. I needed $5,000 for surgery. I called you too. Do you remember what you said to me?" Keisha's eyes widened. She remembered. "You told me that you were busy getting a facial?" I said, reciting her words from memory. "You told me that I should stop being so dramatic. You said, and I quote, 'Do not bother rich people with your poor people problems.'" I leaned down slightly so she could see the cold fire in my eyes. "You left me to rot, Keisha. You valued your spa day more than my life. So why should I care if you have to sleep in a motel? Why should I care if you lose a house you never earned?" Keisha opened her mouth to beg again, to offer some empty excuse, but I was done listening. I remembered the way Brad had kicked my chair at the will reading. I remembered how he had treated me like furniture. I looked at my sister clinging to my leg. I flexed my foot and kicked her leg. It was not a violent kick, but it was firm. It was dismissive. It was the physical manifestation of an eviction. "Get off me," I said, icy and sharp. "You are wrinkling my suit. And unlike you, I actually worked for this." Keisha was still sobbing on the floor, but my father Marcus decided it was his turn to degrade himself. He did not crawl, but he looked like he wanted to. He shuffled toward the table, his hands clasping and unclasping in a nervous rhythm. The scratches on his face from Viola's fingernails were bright red and angry. He looked at me with watery eyes, trying to summon the fatherly authority he had abandoned years ago to chase a fantasy. "Nia, please," he wheezed, his voice trembling. "Be reasonable. I am an old man. I cannot start over at my age. You saw the files. You know what happened. That woman Sugar, she tricked me. She emptied the secret accounts, Nia. She took the cash and vanished. She left me with nothing. I have nothing left but the collection. Please do not take the cars. They are my only assets. They are my retirement. If you take them, I will be destitute. I looked at him with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. The audacity was breathtaking. He was actually asking me to pity him because his paid mistress had outsmarted him. He stood there expecting sympathy for his own betrayal. Let me understand this correctly, Dad, I said, my voice flat and hard. You spent 10 years embezzling money from your wife's company to support a mistress. You drained the maintenance fund to buy her condos and convertibles while I was taking out loans for medical care. You used Mom's money to feed your ego. And now that your girlfriend has robbed you blind, you want me to step in. You want the daughter you ignored to finance the lifestyle you stole. You want me to use my legitimate money to subsidize your bad choices. I stood up and walked over to the window looking out at the Atlanta skyline. You want to keep the cars? I asked. Yes, yes, please, Nia. Marcus stammered, hope lighting up his pathetic face. Just the Corvette and the Rolls. I can sell them later. I can live off that. I turned back to him, my expression unyielding. I am afraid that is impossible. I have already signed the consignment order. The entire collection is being loaded onto flatbed trucks as we speak. They are being auctioned off tomorrow morning. Marcus looked like I had shot him. Auctioned? He gasped. Yes, I said. And just so you know, I am donating 100% of the proceeds to a local charity that supports single mothers who have been victims of financial abuse. I think it is poetic, do not you? Your vanity will finally serve the women you spent a lifetime disrespecting. Marcus made a sound like a wounded animal. His knees buckled and he slumped against the mahogany wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He buried his face in his hands and wailed. It was not a dignified cry. It was the loud, ugly sobbing of a spoiled child who had finally been told no. He rocked back and forth, tears leaking through his fingers, weeping for his lost toys, while Viola stared at him with dead eyes. The room was filled with the sound of their ruin, and I had never heard a sweeter melody. Keisha was broken, and Marcus was wailing on the floor, but Viola refused to stay down. She was a woman who had built her entire existence on appearances, and she would not let the facade crumble without a fight. She stood up, stepping over her husband's legs, and smoothed her skirt. She fixed her gaze on me, attempting to summon the terrifying matriarch who had controlled my life for 3 decades. She raised her chin, tilting it at that sharp angle that used to make me flinch when I was a child. You will not do this, Nia, she said, her voice shaking but loud enough to fill the room. You are bluffing. I am your mother. I gave you life. You think you can evict me. You think you can humiliate me in front of the entire city. You are wrong. The society of Atlanta will spit on you. They will see you for the ungrateful monster you are. You will be a pariah. No one will do business with a woman who destroys her own parents. I looked at her and laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. I walked closer to her, invading her personal space until I could see the cracks in her foundation. Oh, Mother, I said, shaking my head. You still do not understand how this city works, do you? The society you care so much about does not care about blood. They do not care about loyalty, and they certainly do not care about family values. They care about zeros in a bank account. Yesterday you were the queen of Buckhead because you had the checkbook. Today you are a broke fraud with a cheating husband and a felon daughter. And me. I am the solvent creditor holding a $35 million note. They will not spit on me, Mother. They will invite me to the gala. They will ask for my investment advice. In this town, money is the only morality that matters. And right now, I am the most moral person in the room. Viola's lip trembled. She looked around the office looking for an ally, but found only Sterling, who was studiously ignoring her. She realized she had no leverage. Her social capital was as bankrupt as her financial capital. I turned back to the table and picked up a single silver key from my portfolio. It was not a grand key. It was small and simple, the kind that opened a deadbolt on a standard door. However, I said, holding the key up to the light, I am not a monster. I am not you. I am willing to offer you a lifeline. I own a small property in Decatur. It is a two-bedroom apartment. It is clean. It is safe. It is not the mansion, and you will have to do your own laundry, but it is better than the homeless shelter downtown. Viola stared at the key. Her eyes were hungry. It was a step down from her throne, but it was a roof. It was survival. She reached for it, her hand trembling. I pulled the key back just out of her reach. Ah, I said sharply. Not yet. There is a price. You can have the apartment. You can have a small monthly stipend for groceries. But you only get this key if you answer one question. Just one. And you have to answer it with absolute honesty for the first time in your life. The room went silent. Marcus stopped crying and looked up. Keisha held her breath, wiping snot from her nose. Even Sterling leaned forward in his chair. The air was thick with tension. Viola looked at the key, then at me. Her pride was warring with her desperation. Ask it, she whispered. I leaned in close, my voice barely a whisper, but heavy with 30 years of pain. I held the silver key between my thumb and forefinger, letting it catch the light. It was a cheap piece of metal, but right now it was the most valuable object in my mother's world. It represented a bed, a shower, and a door she could lock. It was the difference between dignity and the street. Viola stared at it, her eyes watering with a mixture of greed and terror. She knew me well enough to know that I did not ask easy questions. I looked her dead in the eye, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. When I was 15 years old, I began, my voice steady and low. Your 5-carat diamond solitaire ring went missing from your vanity. It was the one Dad bought you for your 10th anniversary. You went straight to Grandfather. You did not ask me. You did not look for it. You told him I stole it. You told him I was jealous and ungrateful and a thief. Viola flinched as if I had raised a hand to strike her. She tried to look away, but I stepped closer, forcing her to hold my gaze. Grandfather believed you. I continued, letting the memory wash over me. He took his leather belt to me, Mother. It was the only time he ever laid a hand on me in anger. He beat me until I could barely walk. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was that he banned me from his study. He looked at me with disgust for 10 years. For a decade, I lost his trust and his affection because he thought I was a criminal. He died thinking I had betrayed him. I leaned in closer, my face inches from hers. So tell me the truth, Viola. Tell me right now in front of everyone. Did I steal that ring? Where did it go? Viola began to tremble violently. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. She looked at Keisha, who was still sniffing on the floor. She looked at Marcus, who was staring at the wall in a daze. She knew what the truth would do. Admitting it would destroy the last remnant of her image. It would prove that she was not just a strict mother, but a monster who had sacrificed her child's body and soul to cover her own tracks. It would reveal that the hatred she had for me was born of her own guilt. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She closed it again, shaking her head. I can't, she whispered. Mr. Sterling checked his watch, the gold Rolex glinting under the fluorescent lights. He did not look up from his wrist. Mrs. Brooks, he said, his voice cutting through her hesitation like a scalpel. I would suggest you weigh your options carefully. The eviction notice for the estate is already printed. The shelters in Atlanta are currently at full capacity. You have 30 seconds to answer the question. The apartment or the underpass? It is your choice. Viola looked at the key in my hand. She looked at the terrified faces of her husband and favorite daughter. She realized she had nowhere left to hide. The facade crumbled. Her shoulders slumped, and the years of pretense melted away, leaving a scared old woman. Viola stared at the cheap silver key in my hand like it was the Holy Grail. Her chest heaved as she fought the internal war between her vanity and her survival. The threat of sleeping under a bridge finally broke her. She slumped forward, her posture collapsing as the truth clawed its way out of her throat. I sold it, she whispered. Her voice was so quiet I almost missed it. I did not move. Speak up, I commanded. I sold it, She screamed, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. I took the ring to a pawn shop on Cheshire Bridge Road. I had debts. I was playing poker at the club, and I lost $10,000 in one night. I was terrified your father would find out. He would have cut off my allowance. I had to pay the debt immediately. The room was silent save for her jagged breathing. I stood still, letting the admission wash over me. She was a thief and a gambler. But that was not the whole truth. Why me? I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of a 20-year-old wound. Why did you blame me? You could have said you lost it. You could have said it was stolen by a maid. Why did you make grandfather beat me? Viola looked up at me. Her eyes were red and swollen, but for a moment, the old cruelty flickered behind them. Because you were the easy target, Nia, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You were always so dark, so sullen and serious. You stood in the corners at parties while Keisha danced in the center. You looked like trouble. You looked like someone who would steal. Keisha was too pretty. She was my perfect little doll with her bright skin and her smile. No one would ever believe a princess stole a diamond. But you were the shadow in the house. It was easy to make your father believe that the darkness on your skin matched the darkness in your heart. The words hit me harder than the belt ever had. It was not just greed. It was hate. It was colorism. My own mother had looked at my skin tone and decided I was disposable. She had sacrificed my body and my relationship with my grandfather to protect her golden child and her gambling habit. She had let me carry the shame of a thief for 2 decades, simply because I was not the light-skinned daughter she wanted. I closed my eyes. A single hot tear escaped and rolled down my cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release. For 20 years I had wondered if there was something wrong with me. I had wondered if I was unlovable. Now I knew the truth. I was never bad. I was just the wrong shade of brown for a woman who hated herself. The weight of the injustice lifted off my shoulders, leaving me feeling lighter than I had ever felt in my life. The sound of slow, deliberate clapping broke the trance. Clap, clap, clap. I opened my eyes. Mr. Sterling was standing up beside the monitor. He was not looking at the papers anymore. He was looking at Viola with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal disgust. Thank you, Mrs. Brooks, he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. We have that confession on record, and I must inform you that your admission of guilt regarding the theft and the subsequent framing of Nia has just triggered the conditions for the final envelope. The room was so quiet that the hum of the building's air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. Sterling reached into the bottom drawer of his desk, a drawer that was double-locked and required a separate key on his watch chain to open. He pulled out an envelope that looked like it belonged in a museum. It was made of thick, creamy parchment yellowed at the edges by time. On the back, it was sealed with a heavy blob of red wax, stamped with the Ezekiel family crest. Viola stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb. In a way it was. Your father was a man of patterns, Mrs. Brooks Sterling said, running his thumb over the wax seal. He noticed that the ring disappeared the same week you asked for an advance on your trust fund. He noticed that Nia, who had never taken a penny that wasn't hers, was suddenly branded a thief. He suspected the truth for 20 years. But Ezekiel was a man of evidence. He needed you to say it. He needed you to confirm out loud that you were willing to destroy your daughter to save your reputation. Sterling stood up and walked around the desk, holding the envelope up for everyone to see. This envelope is marked "The Truth." It was given to me with strict instructions. It was only to be opened if and when Viola Brooks admitted to framing Nia for the theft of the diamond. If you had gone to your grave with that lie, this envelope would have been incinerated unopened. But you didn't. You chose the apartment. You chose survival over your secret. Viola looked sick. She clutched her chest, her eyes darting between the envelope and her husband. What is in there? She rasped. Sterling didn't answer immediately. He cracked the wax seal. The dry, snapping sound echoed in the room like a gunshot. He slid a silver letter opener under the flap and sliced the paper open. He reached inside and pulled out two documents. The first was a legal document, a codicil to the last will and testament freshly dated just weeks before Ezekiel died. The second was much older. It was a single sheet of medical paper, the edges crinkled and brown. It was dated October 14th, 1990. I leaned forward. I recognized the letterhead on the old paper. It was from a genetic testing laboratory. Sterling adjusted his glasses and looked at the papers, his expression unreadable. He looked at Marcus, then at Viola, and finally his gaze landed on me. There was a flicker of something new in his eyes. Not pity, not respect. It was awe. He placed the papers on the mahogany table, smoothing them out with care. "You thought the bankruptcy was the punishment," Sterling said softly. "You thought losing the house was the finale." But Ezekiel prepared one final lesson. He looked at the DNA test, and then back at the family. Now comes the most dramatic part. Sterling picked up the brittle sheet of medical paper with a reverence usually reserved for religious texts. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at Viola, who was staring at the document with a mixture of confusion and dread. She knew what a paternity test looked like, but she could not fathom why her father would have kept one from 1990. "This document," Sterling began, his voice echoing off the paneled walls, "is the result of a DNA comparison between Ezekiel Brooks and yourself, Viola. It was conducted shortly after your mother passed away. Ezekiel found some letters. He had suspicions. He needed to know if the child he was raising was truly his own. He turned the paper around and slid it across the table. His finger tapped the bottom line of the results. The probability of paternity is 0%, Sterling read aloud. Ezekiel Brooks is excluded as the biological father of Viola Brooks. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Viola did not scream. She did not faint. She simply froze. Her eyes bulged and her mouth fell open in a grotesque mask of shock. The woman who had spent 50 years looking down her nose at everyone who was not an Ezekiel, the woman who prided herself on her royal bloodline, was a lie. "That is a lie," she whispered, finally finding her voice. It was a high, thin sound. "I am his daughter. I have his name." "You have his name because he was a good man," Sterling corrected her sharply. "Your mother had an affair, Viola." Ezekiel knew. He knew the moment he saw the results. "But he loved your mother, and he believed that a child should not be punished for the sins of the parent. He decided to raise you as his own. He gave you his name. He gave you his wealth. He gave you every opportunity to prove that family is about character, not biology." Sterling leaned forward, his eyes cold. "But you failed that test. For decades he watched you become cruel. He watched you become vain. But the breaking point was Nia. He watched you abuse a child who he loved more than life itself. He saw you treat Nia like an outsider because of her skin tone, because she was different." Sterling picked up the second document, the fresh codicil. "He wrote this in his final days," Sterling said. "He told me that he could not allow his legacy to pass to a fraud. He said that while you are not his blood, Nia is his spirit. Nia has his discipline. Nia has his intelligence. Nia is the true heir of Ezekiel Brooks, regardless of genetics. And you, Viola, you are nothing but a charity case that went wrong." Viola looked like she was having a stroke. Her entire identity, the foundation of her arrogance, had been vaporized in 60 seconds. She looked at her hands as if they belonged to a stranger. She looked at Marcus, who was staring at her with wide, horrified eyes. She was not the Queen of Buckhead. She was the bastard daughter of an affair kept around out of pity. "You are a genetic stranger to this family," Sterling said ruthlessly. "You have no claim to the bloodline. You have no claim to the name. And as of this moment, you have no claim to the fortune. You are exactly what you accused Nia of being for 20 years. You are the imposter." I watched her crumble. It was not a physical collapse this time. It was a spiritual implosion. The light went out of her eyes. The haughtiness vanished. She sat there in her designer clothes, a hollow shell of a woman, realizing that her entire existence was a lie she had told herself to feel superior. And I, the daughter she had rejected, sat across from her holding the deed to the empire she thought was her birthright. The irony was so perfect it tasted like wine. Sterling was not finished. He reached into the unsealed envelope one last time and pulled out a second sheet of medical data. The room was already spinning from the revelation of Viola's parentage, but Sterling held the paper like a final nail for the coffin. "There is one more test," Sterling said, his voice devoid of emotion. Since Ezekiel questioned his own paternity, he naturally questioned the paternity of his grandchildren. He ran tests on both Nia and Keisha without your knowledge 20 years ago. He looked at Marcus, who was still slumped on the floor, wiping his nose. "Marcus, you have spent your life apologizing to Viola. You spent 30 years feeling lucky that a woman of her stature married you. You tolerated her insults. You tolerated her spending. You even tolerated her hatred of Nia because you thought she was the superior partner." Sterling slid the paper toward Marcus. "The results show that Nia is a 99.9% genetic match to Marcus Brooks. Nia is your daughter, Marcus. She has your nose, she has your eyes, and yes, she has your skin tone." Viola froze. She knew what was coming next. However, Sterling continued, turning his gaze to Keisha. "The results for Keisha are conclusive. 0% match. Marcus Brooks is excluded as the biological father." The silence shattered. Marcus scrambled to his feet, snatching the paper from the table. He scanned the lines, his eyes bulging. "Viola," Sterling said, his voice cutting like a knife, "you didn't just inherit your mother's trust fund. You inherited her habits. You had an affair, and judging by the genetic markers and Keisha's complexion, it was with a white man. That is why you favored her. That is why you hated Nia. Nia was a reminder of the husband you despised. Keisha was the souvenir of the lover you preferred. You have been playing Marcus for a fool for 30 years. A low, guttural growl rose from Marcus's throat. It was a sound of primal rage that had been suppressed for 3 decades. He looked at Keisha, the daughter he had spoiled, the daughter he had ruined himself to please, and saw a stranger. Then he looked at Viola. "You made me raise another man's bastard," he roared. He launched himself across the room. He did not stumble this time. He moved with the speed of pure hatred. His hands clamped around Viola's throat before she could even scream. The chair toppled over as they hit the floor. "You lied to me," he screamed, tightening his grip. "I gave you everything." Viola gagged her face, turning purple, clawing uselessly at his hands. "Security," Sterling said calmly into the intercom. 2 burly guards burst through the doors. They grabbed Marcus by the shoulders and hauled him off Viola, pinning him against the wall. He was still kicking, spitting at his wife, screaming obscenities that echoed off the expensive paneling. Viola lay on the carpet, gasping for air, rubbing her bruised neck, her eyes wide with terror. I stood up slowly, picking up my portfolio. I looked at the wreckage. My mother was a fraud. My sister was illegitimate. My father was a cuckold held back by guards. I walked to the door and stopped, turning back to face them one last time. "The irony is beautiful," I said, my voice clear and strong. "You spent my entire life treating me like the black sheep. You treated me like I didn't belong. But look at the math. I am the only person in this room who shares blood with Dad. And thanks to Grandfather's will, I am the only person he actually chose." I looked at Marcus, then at Viola. "Enjoy the apartment." I walked out of the office and didn't look back. The guards dragged Marcus back to his chair, forcing him to sit. The room was a tableau of absolute ruin. Viola lay on the floor, rubbing her bruised throat, looking up at Sterling with the eyes of a trapped animal. She had lost her husband, her lineage, and her dignity, but she was still clutching the cheap silver key I had put on the table. She thought she still had a lifeline. She thought she had secured a roof over her head by confessing to her crime. Sterling cleared his throat, drawing attention to the final page of the codicil. He did not sit down. He stood tall, acting as the voice of Ezekiel Brooks from beyond the grave. "We are not quite finished," he said, his voice grave. There is a specific clause regarding the distribution of assets in light of these revelations. Ezekiel was very specific. He anticipated that the truth would only come out under extreme duress. He looked down at the document and began to read. Because Viola Brooks has been proven to be a genetic stranger to my line, and more importantly because she has proven herself to be morally bankrupt by framing an innocent child for her own vices, I hereby revoke all previous bequests. She is to be stripped of the family name. She is to be stripped of all titles. Sterling paused, looking directly at Viola. And here is the addendum regarding support. I specifically forbid the trust or the heir from providing any financial assistance, housing, or sustenance to Viola Brooks or her illegitimate issue Keisha. They are to receive nothing, not a single penny, not a single brick. They are to leave this life as they entered it, empty-handed. Viola scrambled to her knees. But the apartment, she stammered, holding up the silver key. Naya promised. I confessed. I did what you asked. We made a deal. I walked back to the table. I looked at the key trembling in her hand. I did make a deal, Mother. I said, my voice cool and detached. But Grandfather outranked me. This is his will. And as the executor and sole beneficiary, I am legally bound to follow his instructions. He knew you better than I did. He knew that if you were left with even a scrap of comfort, you would never learn. He wanted you to feel the cold. I reached out and plucked the silver key from her fingers. She tried to hold on to it, her grip desperate, but she was weak. I took it back and dropped it into my pocket. There is no apartment, I said. There is no stipend for groceries. There is no charity. You are not an Ezekiel. You are a fraud who got caught. Keisha looked up from the floor, her face pale. So we have nothing. Nothing, I confirmed. You have the clothes on your back. Although technically those belong to the company too. But I will be generous. You can keep them. Consider it a severance package. The reality hit Viola like a physical blow. The last safety net was gone. She was not just moving down in the world. She was falling off the edge of it. She looked at the luxury office, at the daughter she had abused, who was now a multi-millionaire, and at the future that held nothing but concrete and hunger. Her mouth opened. At first there was no sound. Then a low keen started in her chest. It built and built, rising in pitch and volume until it tore from her throat. It was not a word. It was a scream. A long, horrifying scream of a woman who had lost her soul and her world in the span of an hour. She screamed until her breath ran out, and the sound echoed off the mahogany walls, marking the death of the dynasty and the birth of my freedom. The scream that tore from Viola's throat was not just a sound of distress. It was the sound of a universe imploding. For 50 years she had walked through the world believing she was better than everyone else. She believed her blood was blue. She believed her judgment was infallible. She believed her status was a law of nature. In the span of 5 minutes she had been stripped of her money, her marriage, her father's name, and her very identity. The scream went on, a jagged, high-pitched shriek that made the glass water pitcher on the table vibrate. Then silence. Her eyes rolled back into her head, completely white. Her body went rigid for a split second before collapsing like a marionette whose strings had been cut. She hit the floor with a heavy thud right next to the chair where Marcus sat seething. She did not move. The woman who had terrorized my childhood with a raised eyebrow was now just a pile of expensive fabric on a dirty rug. She had chosen unconsciousness because reality was simply too expensive for her to afford. I looked over at Keisha. She was not screaming. She had slid from her knees to a sitting position, her legs splayed out in front of her like a discarded toddler. She was staring at her hands. For her entire life, Viola had praised her light skin. Viola had told her she was the beautiful one, the special one, the one who looked like royalty. Now Keisha knew the truth. Her complexion was not a gift from God. It was evidence of a betrayal. It was the mark of the stranger her mother had slept with. She was not the princess of the dynasty. She was the proof of the crime. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She just rocked back and forth, tears streaming silently down a face that no longer held any power. She looked at Marcus, who refused to look at her. The father who had bought her ponies and cars now looked at her with pure revulsion. She was alone in a room full of people. I stood up and smoothed the front of my jacket. I picked up my leather portfolio and checked my watch. I had a meeting with the factory foreman in an hour to restart production. I had a brand to rebuild. I had no more time for theatrics. I looked at the security guards who were watching the scene with a mixture of shock and pity. I gestured to the unconscious woman and the sobbing girl on the floor. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice cool and businesslike. They snapped to attention, looking at me for orders. "Escort Mr. Brooks to his vehicle," I instructed, pointing to Marcus. "He is free to go. As for the other two..." I looked down at Viola and Keisha one last time. I felt nothing. No anger, no joy. Just the satisfaction of a ledger finally balanced. "Call an ambulance for the older woman," I said, turning toward the door. "And call a cab for the younger one. Make sure they are off the premises in 10 minutes. I have work to do." I walked to the double doors and paused, my hand on the brass handle. I looked back at Sterling, who was watching me with a small, proud smile. "Clean up this mess," I said. I pushed the doors open and walked out into the bright Atlanta sunshine, leaving the darkness behind me forever. The 30-day grace period expired at noon. The sheriff's deputies were punctual. They did not care that this house had hosted senators and celebrities. They only cared about the court order signed by the creditor, me. I stood in the driveway watching the final act of the tragedy unfold. It was a beautiful, crisp Atlanta afternoon. The kind of day Viola used to love because the light flattered her complexion. Today the light only illuminated the grime on the windows and the weeds beginning to sprout in the manicured lawn. The landscape crew had been fired 3 weeks ago. The decay was already setting in. A courier van pulled up to the curb. A man jumped out holding a thick envelope. He did not hand it to a butler because there were no butlers left. He handed it to Keisha, who was sitting on the front steps. She tore it open with a dull lack of interest. It was not a love letter. It was a divorce decree. Brad had not just left, he had vanished. He had filed for dissolution of marriage, citing irreconcilable financial differences. He had fled to Florida to find a new host, leaving Keisha to face the music alone. She dropped the papers onto the concrete and stared at nothing. Then the heavy oak doors opened. Viola stepped out. She was not wearing Chanel. She was wearing a mismatched tracksuit I recognized from a donation pile. She was not carrying the limited edition Hermes trunks. She was dragging 2 heavy-duty black plastic trash bags. They bumped against the stairs with a hollow thud. Thump, 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 the sound of a life reduced to garbage. Behind her, the repo team was moving efficiently. 2 men were hauling out the grand piano. Another team was loading the oil paintings into a climate-controlled van. Every item was tagged, cataloged, and seized. The proceeds would go toward the $35 million debt. It would barely make a dent, but it was the principle that mattered. Viola stopped at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at the moving truck. She looked at the for auction sign planted in the lawn. And then she looked up. I was standing on the master suite balcony, the same balcony where she used to stand and look down on the staff, the same balcony where she had once laughed at my cheap car. I was leaning against the stone railing, holding a crystal glass filled with a vintage Cabernet. The wine was dark and rich, the color of blood. Our eyes met. There was no defiance left in hers, only a vast, empty hunger. She saw me standing in her place, holding her glass, ruling her kingdom. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. It tasted like victory. I did not wave. I did not smile. I simply watched them drag their trash bags down the long driveway toward the waiting taxi. They were small figures in the distance, shrinking with every step until they were gone. The driveway was empty. The house was mine. The silence was perfect. The security guard at the front desk called up to my office at 2 p.m. He said there was a man in the lobby asking for me. He said the man looked harmless but sad. I told him to send him up. When the elevator doors opened, Marcus stepped out. He looked unrecognizable. The silk suits were gone, replaced by a faded windbreaker and generic jeans. He was carrying a cheap duffel bag that looked half empty. He looked smaller, as if the weight of his ego had finally been stripped away, leaving only the fragile bones of an old man. He stood in the doorway of the CEO office, the office he had technically occupied for 30 years, but never truly owned. He did not come in. He stayed on the threshold. "I am going back to Alabama, Nia," he said, his voice raspy. "I have a cousin there. He says I can sleep on his porch until I find work." I sat behind the massive oak desk, my grandfather's desk, and looked at him. I did not offer him a seat. "Okay," I said simply. He shifted his weight, looking at his canvas sneakers. I wanted to say, "I am sorry. Not for the money, not for the car, but because I was weak. I let her hurt you, Nia. I sat there eating my dinner while she destroyed your confidence. I was so afraid of losing my lifestyle that I sacrificed my daughter. I was a coward." He looked up at me, tears rimming his red eyes. "I should have protected you." I opened the top drawer of my desk. I pulled out a small bank book I had prepared earlier that morning. I walked around the desk and held it out to him. He looked at it confused. "What is this?" "It is a savings account with $50,000 in it," I said. His mouth dropped open. "Nia, I do not deserve this." "No, you do not," I agreed, keeping my voice steady. "You were a terrible father. You were an embezzler and a spineless enabler. But I am giving you this for one reason only." I placed the book in his trembling hand. "You never hit me," I said. "Viola beat me with words. Grandfather beat me with a belt. You were just absent. You were neglectful, but you were never violent. That is the only reason you are not sleeping under a bridge tonight." He clutched the book to his chest like it was a lifeline. "Thank you," he choked out. "Thank you, baby girl." "Don't call me that," I said, my voice turning to ice. "And listen to me carefully, Marcus. This is a one-time transaction. This is not the start of a relationship. Do not call me. Do not write to me. Do not show up at this building ever again. As far as you are concerned, I am a stranger who did you a favor. If you try to contact me, I will consider it harassment and I will have you arrested. Do we understand each other?" He nodded vigorously, the tears finally spilling over. "I understand. Goodbye, Nia." He turned and walked toward the elevator, pressing the down button with a shaking finger. I watched him step inside. As the doors closed, he was openly weeping, his face buried in his hands. The metal doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of his regret. I turned back to my desk and sat down. The room was quiet. The last ghost was gone. The bronze letters of Ezekiel Hair Care hit the pavement with a heavy clang, sending a cloud of concrete dust into the air. I watched from the street level as the crane lowered the new signage into place. It was sleek, modern, and made of polished steel that caught the Atlanta sun. Phoenix and Ezekiel Global. The name was not vanity, it was a statement of fact. The Phoenix represented the trust that had saved the assets, the resurrection from the ashes of bankruptcy. And Ezekiel represented the only man in this family who had actually possessed a spine. The era of the Brooks family business was over. This was a meritocracy now. I went back inside and took the elevator to the top floor. My management style was a shock to the system. I did not run the company like a social club. I ran it like a crime scene investigation. I used my forensic accounting background to autopsy every single department. I fired the marketing VP who had spent $50,000 on influencer brunches. I terminated the logistics manager who was taking kickbacks from trucking companies. I installed real-time auditing software on every corporate credit card. Transparency became the new currency. If you couldn't justify the expense in a spreadsheet, you didn't spend the money. The employees who actually worked hard, the chemists, the factory line workers, the warehouse staff saw their wages increase by 20%. Morale skyrocketed. For the first time in decades, the company was profitable, not because of a lie, but because of efficiency. At 5 p.m., I left the office and had my driver take me to Phipps Plaza. I walked into Tiffany's. I did not browse. I knew exactly what I wanted. I would like to see the 5-carat solitaire, I said to the clerk. The emerald cut, flawless clarity. The sales associate's eyes widened. A beautiful choice, ma'am. Is this for an engagement? Is the lucky gentleman joining us? I laughed. It was a genuine light sound. There is no gentleman, I said, pulling out my own black card, one that was backed by liquid assets, not debt. And I am not waiting for someone to decide I am worthy of a ring. I am buying it for myself. I paid in full. I put the ring on my right hand. It was heavy, cold, and magnificent. It was the same size as the ring Viola had accused me of stealing 20 years ago. Every time I looked at it, it would remind me that I didn't need to steal beauty. I had the power to acquire it on my own terms. I returned to the office for one final task. The service elevator was open and a team of movers was loading boxes onto a truck. The boxes were filled with the personal effects seized from the Buckhead estate, specifically the wardrobes of Viola and Keisha. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of couture furs and silk that they had used to armor themselves against the world. The charity coordinator handed me a clipboard. "Are you sure about this, Ms. Brooks?" she asked. "This is a lot of value. We could auction these off for a fortune." I looked at the mountain of clothes. I saw the dress Viola wore when she slapped me. I saw the jacket Keisha wore when she mocked my job. "No," I said, signing the donation release with a flourish. "Give them away. Give them to women entering the workforce. Give them to women starting over after leaving abusive homes. Let these clothes finally serve a purpose other than vanity. Strip the tags off. Let them just be fabric." I handed the clipboard back and watched the truck doors roll shut. The last physical remnants of their toxicity were gone, repurposed to help strangers rise up. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and opened my laptop. The screen glowed with green numbers: profit, growth, future. I began to type. The morning sun hit the hood of the vintage red convertible, creating a glare that would have blinded me a year ago. But today, it just looked like a spotlight. It was the same 1965 Corvette Stingray my father had hidden in a storage unit to keep from Viola. Now it was fully restored, the engine purring with a deep, throaty rumble that vibrated through the steering wheel. I was not driving to a cubicle to fix someone else's mistakes. I was driving to the headquarters of Phoenix and Ezekiel. I approached the intersection of Peachtree and Lenox, the heart of Buckhead's commercial district. The light turned red. I eased the car to a stop, the brakes biting smoothly. To my right, there was a public bus shelter. The glass was etched with graffiti, and the bench was crowded with commuters waiting for the number 110 bus. I idly glanced over. My eyes landed on two women huddled on the far end of the bench. They looked out of place, yet entirely part of the scenery of struggle. The older woman was wearing a gray wool coat that was 2 sizes too big and pilled at the elbows. The younger one was in a faded denim jacket, her hair pulled back in a frizzy, unkempt ponytail. They were fighting. The older woman yanked a half-empty plastic water bottle out of the younger girl's hands, her mouth moving in a silent, angry scold. It took a moment for my brain to reconcile the image. It was Viola and Keisha. They looked decades older. The Botox had worn off, leaving Viola's face sagging and bitter. Keisha looked exhausted, stripped of the lashes and contouring that had been her armor. They were not plotting a hostile takeover. They were squabbling over $1's worth of hydration. Viola turned her head to check for the bus. Her gaze swept past the street and locked onto the bright red car. Then she looked at the driver. I saw the recognition hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes widened. Her mouth formed a perfect O. She dropped the water bottle. It rolled into the gutter. She stood up, stumbling slightly on the uneven pavement. She stepped toward the curb, waving her arms frantically. She was shouting something. I could read her lips. "Nia, Baby, look at mommy. She looked ready to run into traffic. She looked ready to sell her soul again for a seat in this leather interior. I looked at her. I did not feel pity. I did not feel hate. I felt absolutely nothing. She was just a pedestrian, a stranger at a bus stop. I reached into the center console and retrieved my sunglasses. They were oversized, dark, and expensive. I slid them onto my face, blocking out the glare and blocking out the woman waving on the curb. The traffic light turned green. I did not look back. I pressed the accelerator. The Corvette surged forward, the engine roaring a powerful goodbye. I left them behind in the exhaust fumes shrinking in the rearview mirror until they were nothing but specks of dust in my past. I felt the wind in my hair. I took a deep breath of the fresh air. Blood is random. It is a biological accident. But family is a choice. It is the people who respect you. It is the peace you build with your own hands. I am done carrying their baggage. I choose my own path. I choose happiness. The saga of the Brooks family serves as a powerful reminder that true success is built on competence, not entitlement. Nia's rise from a neglected spare to a powerful tycoon proves that financial literacy and resilience are the ultimate weapons against oppression. While Viola and Keisha chased the illusion of wealth, they crumbled under the weight of their own vanity and incompetence. Ultimately, this story teaches us that blood does not mandate loyalty. You have the right to sever ties with toxic family members who exploit you. Your value is defined by what you build, not what you inherit. If you enjoyed seeing Nia get the justice she deserved, hit the like button and subscribe for more satisfying stories of karma